Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Derecka Purnell discussing her new book, Becoming Abolitionists, Police, Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom. She is joined tonight in conversation by Imani Perry. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. Our fall season is in full swing and it's an amazing lineup. Make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to purchase a copy of Becoming Abolitionists, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual author series wouldn't be possible. Thank you so much for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. We'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can, so thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I'm so excited to introduce tonight's speakers. Derecka Purnell is a busy woman. Besides having her writing featured in the New York Times, NPR, The Atlantic, The Boston Globe, Harper's Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, Slate, and several other publications, Derecka is also a human rights lawyer. She received her JD from Harvard Law School and works to end police and prison violence by providing legal assistance, research, and training to community-based organizations through an abolitionist framework. Derecka currently is a columnist for The Guardian. She is joined in conversation by Imani Perry. Imani is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is the author of 6 books, including the award-winning Looking for Lorraine, which received several awards and was named 2018 Notable Book by the New York Times. Tonight, they are discussing Becoming Abolitionists. For more than a century, activists in the United States have tried to reform the police, but that hasn't stopped police from killing roughly 3 people a day. Derecka details how multiracial social movements rooted in rebellion, risk-taking, and revolutionary love pushed her and a generation of activists towards abolition. Becoming Abolitionist shows that abolition is not solely about getting rid of police, but a commitment to create and support different answers to the problem of harm in society. And most excitingly, an opportunity to reduce and eliminate harm in the first place. I'll leave you with this quote from Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. With deep insight and moral clarity, Purnell shares her compelling journey of political education and personal transformation, inviting us not only to imagine a world without police, but to muster the courage to fight for more than just the world we know is possible. And on that note of extreme praise, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Derecka, Imani, thank you so much for being here tonight. The virtual stage is yours. I'm so happy to have you both here.
Thank you so much for that introduction.
Thanks, Audrey. Derecka.
Oh, you're too much. I'm like, I am sweating already.
Well, okay. I just want to start by saying I'm so thrilled to talk to you. I love talking to you anyway. And I am especially excited about talking about this extraordinary book. It's hard to tell the story of one's life in a way that is both a deep intellectual interrogation and an emotional exploration. It's hard to be vulnerable. You've done all that, and you also, and the title is such an instruction because, you know, we say becoming is like a sign of a coming of age story.
Yeah.
You have the plural, abolitionists. So we know from the beginning, it's not just about your becoming. It's like your journey becomes representative in a way that is incredibly generous and beautiful, and it's evident all through the pages.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. So I'm like blushing. Thank you so much. That's so kind. Thank you.
It's true. I'm not saying it to be kind. It's because it's true, and it's also very sophisticated politically. So I just want to say like some really quick things, and then I'm going to ask you questions. So,
Yes, please.
yeah, because one of the things that I think is so special is that it reminded me almost, and this may sound like a strange analogy, but it really does, like a book like Siddhartha, right, which is like this sort of
Mm,
kind of journey through Buddhism, in the sense that you begin with the context of your life and you tell this story of evolution, right? And then you give us a vision of what abolition is. Being an abolitionist is not a destination.
mhm.
It's a relation to the world. And so your politics unfold as you encounter both, injustice and justice movements, and see the sort of dance between the two, and then the failures, and this sort of like a re-encounter. And it's not like, I mean, you talk about what works you read and the like, but it's more this you observe the world, you're analyzing what comes, and it's so you start the story, right? You start the story with your childhood, um and I guess my first question would be is what was that process like for you to tell the story of being um a Black child, a girl child in the
Mhm.
Midwest, in a poor community, right? Deep love, but also grief and repression, environmental racism, toxic, you know.
Wow, starting with the easy question. Wow. What was that like for me? So the book, I started over so many times.
Okay.
I started this book over so many times because I wasn't quite sure where to start, right? I wasn't sure if I should start with an intellectual or historical genealogy of abolition, like as a phrase. Like, so after a while, I realized that it may be easier to start with how I came to this idea of justice in the first place. And through that, I found myself going back further and further and further. So I thought I would start with me being a lawyer. Then I realized, like, oh no, there was this stuff going on when I was in college, right? And then I was like, oh, there was actually all this injustice I witnessed in high school. And then I went back to middle school and I was like, oh yeah, my first actual encounter of injustice that I recall that wasn't systemic or structural in a way that I could articulate was when a lunch lady, right, denied me chocolate milk,
Yeah.
right, because I received free and reduced lunch. And I was like, oh, okay, my mom had to explain to me that, oh, she did that because you're poor and you're in this government program. And kids who can afford their lunch, they have the option to choose. And I was, 5, 6 years old. And it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, I had no plan on even sharing that story. I like have laughed about it maybe one other time before, but it was thinking, okay, where do I first get into this idea of justice? Because I think abolition is about sets of just relationships. And by the time I got to that story, I said, wow, I probably should start here, right? So I think in one sense, I felt very honored to talk about my mom, very honored to talk about my grandmother, the kinds of experiences that I had that shaped the kind of writer I hope to be, the kind of mother I hope to be. Also, not to romanticize it and say there was a lot of stuff going on that I also had to decide, oh, I don't want to, be that type of way. And so it was very, very, very interesting and then difficult. And I would say the most difficult part, especially writing the painful parts, is that I didn't anticipate sharing lots of things that I shared in that book. Right. And so even when someone first asked me, like, oh, this book, it kind of has like a memoirish feel, I was like, really? This book? Like, I was in so much denial because there's so much stuff that happened in my life that can't even be captured by some of what I share.
Yeah.
But some of what I ultimately shared, I had to have conversations with people in my family for the first time. Like, some of my sisters, they didn't know that I had experienced certain kinds of violence or what was happening because I was the oldest and they were the youngest. And so as it's like there was like me, the writer, trying to convey a story, and then me, the person, having to actively deal with a lot of that pain and trauma, like with my family as I was writing it as well. And then the conversations with my kids, because it's like, oh yeah, once this is published, they're gonna learn some things about me at some point. And so I have to think about how to be careful and like loving and gracious and honest, and having to prepare them for that, right? And so it was hard and in some ways really, really rewarding. And I'm gonna see how it continues to unfold as time goes on.
Yeah. I mean, I think I want to say, just as a reader, I really appreciate it, because I know it's vulnerable, but it to see your intellectual life, even as a small child, like your emotional life's there, but also you're thinking about these, like what for me, that story is really powerful. And also the way you describe you and your brother in school and what it means to be a, a good kid and a kid who is classified as a bad kid, but the cost of being the good kid, right, is to actually not, I mean, you talk about like not standing up for yourself in the way that your brother did.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard. It's something that he and I have had to talk about, something I've even had to apologize for at some point. And it wasn't that it was explicit antagonism, but I figured out the game pretty early. Like the good kids are the ones who actually don't talk back to teachers.
Right.
You know, that would even start you with like, oh, we should see if this kid is like gifted and talented.
Right.
Or we should see
you
if
wouldn't
this
even
kid...
be considered unless you, right?
Yes, exactly. It would just remove you from the conversation if there was any, And so my brother, like not knowing then, but as time moved on, even when I became a teacher, I realized like, oh, my brother knows that all of this is sort of a game and he refuses to play it. And watching other kids, in my family or kids I went to high school with, refusing to play like on the terms of the education that we were receiving, they were punished, right? They were suspended, they were labeled the bad kids, they received demerits. I mean, there were so many ways to say, this kid is kind of undeserving of a kind of love and attention and care, right? And, why can't you just be like your sister? Why can't you just be like your sister? And so when I was in high school and I started meeting other organized, like education, like like high school student activists, I was like, oh, wow, like these are technically like good kids, but they're pushing back on this system. And I was like, oh, there's a way to do both, right? There's a way to figure out, I don't know what is going on with everyone else. I know that my mama said, I got to go to college and I got to make sure she has someplace to live. I got a family to take care of. I got to be first generation. And these kids are trying to figure that out, right? And then also are pushing back on the idea of these sorts of like pipelines, and trying to fight for really democratic control of our schools. And I was really, really moved by watching kids being able to do back, watching them talk back to teachers with really like intelligent talking points, with being like, oh no, like, or, calling out politicians, calling out the mayor, engaging in demonstrations. I said, wow, this is disruptive in a way that I'm deeply attracted to, because I was afraid of being suspended. I was afraid of being expelled. And so I sort of found my people in that way. But with my brother, our lives just took on very different trajectories because of how he was labeled and because of how I was labeled, right? And just knowing that to be the case still, we have to reckon with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think that, I'm always interested in how this question of integrity and how people tell the stories of those who they love. And you tell your story of your lives with so much integrity. And also there's there's a story of like, there's the courage part, right? Where you like talk about fear of certain repercussions, and then you meet the fear, right? These sort of moments where you're called to courage, right? But also the book itself is a courageous act, right? So there's like two layers of it. And I wonder, there's all these moments, right? There's moments with relationships, with church, with moving through ROTC. Is there a moment or maybe a couple in the book that for you and I'm just saying this to share with the audience, if they haven't yet read it, which they absolutely all should, but that was like the biggest turning point or the most dramatic turning points in your life, where you go from being, a kid to being someone who is literally lives as a freedom fighter.
Oh, wow. Is there one?
Or maybe a couple, but like the major turning points for you.
Oh, this is so hard. So in the book, I talk about like major national tragedies that serve as sort of awakenings, like to me and to other people who are watching and are learning about racism, explicit racism, like for the first time.
Yeah.
And so like I talk about the Jena 6 in Louisiana, watching a group of Black boys and a group of white boys ultimately like get into a racial brawl. And then the group of Black boys, one of them kicks a white kid he beats up a white kid, uses his tennis shoe, and a prosecutor charges him with like assault with a deadly weapon. And again, it felt like anomalous. It was like, oh, wow, what's this stuff? This is a mess. I saw people go and march for it. It seemed like it had an impact. But as a kid, I didn't know that was connected to these broader national sets of injustices, right? So then there's Sean Bell's killed in 2006 in New York City. It was the first police killing that I recall, right? So it's one of the reasons why now when people say, y'all surprised, like this is America, like y'all shouldn't be surprised by insert whatever racial tragedy that happens. And I kind of want to defend surprise, because it's one way that some people actually did not know. Like I just had I was like 15, 16, and I was very surprised that the police could kill an unarmed Black man in his car the night before he was supposed to wed. But I didn't like leave from that and like become a freedom fighter. I struggle with even identifying as a freedom fighter like right now. So the idea that there was like, so there's that. And then when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and then George Zimmerman was ultimately arrested and charged, and I was a part of just a bunch of young people fighting to get him arrested, right? Trying to make sure that he was incarcerated for murdering Trayvon Martin. When George Zimmerman ultimately went to trial, I was pregnant and so afraid for what the outcome of what that particular case would mean for my unborn child. And it was just devastating. And I wouldn't say that it made me like a freedom fighter, like I'm ready to fight now, but it did make me like, the stakes became higher in a different way, right? It just became much higher. And around the time that I was pregnant, there were these neo-Nazi white supremacist marches that were popping up in Missouri, in Kansas City. And so I remember going to these marches and watching the police face us and protect the white supremacists from the counter protesters. I remember one time, someone I worked with begged me to go home, say, they're unpredictable, you might die. And I was like, really? And then you go and you hear this hatred and you're like, oh, wow, these people like want you dead. Like they actually they want you to die. And just, I don't, again, it was politicizing, but it wasn't like before this, I was, your everyday person. And then after I was like, ready to start a revolutionary army. But a lot of these events constantly pushed me to interrogate more, and the resistance to them pushed me even further. And I hope that continues for the rest of my life. Like I hope that I always allow myself to be curious and to be surprised and to be pushed by people who are resistant when these moments happen in our society.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, right, that there's a generosity because you talk about being in process, right? So everybody who reads this can read it and see in themselves the possibility of becoming differently. And I think that's really important. And I also, I was thinking about there's this beautiful connection you draw that for me is like at the heart of the book between, it's a critique of law, right, as a sort of abstract principle of justice. And you talk about it with respect to, coming to Harvard Law School and realizing that not, despite what they say, that it's not like a justice oriented space. I shared that feeling there. But also you talk about the history of slavery and enslavement and the way in which, right. So when we say policing comes from the slave state, like people think it's just a sort of loosen out, but you actually trace the genealogy. What does it mean for, that's constructed that the Black person who is fleeing to freedom is doing something illegal, right? That should make us interrogate it from the very concept.
Right. Yes. Yes. And I think why I tried to explain in the book, because there's so many historians, people with actual PhDs in history who have, written about this, from Sally Hayden to Alex Vitale. I mean, there are histories of police coming out of slave patrols and, being borrowed from the UK to enforce labor laws and break up labor strikes in the US. So that history has been done. I think what was the most profound for me, at least, was that policing is a response to our resistance to slavery. Like it doesn't just start with slave patrols. It starts with resistance to slavery, right? That was so exciting to me. It's like, oh yeah, why would you need a system of patrols? Because people are running away, right? Why do you need a system of surveillance? It's because people are rebelling. Why do you need a system of informants? It's because people are devising secret plans to figure out how to take over this ship. Why do you need a system of raiding, with slave cabins to search for weapons like we see raised today? It's because they were ready to turn up on y'all. And so it's like, it's not that it's simply just in slave patrols. It's because people were always trying to fight capitalism, trying to fight white supremacy, trying to free themselves and their loved ones and even strangers from the binds of the plantation and of the ship. So as soon as people got here, even before, on the way over, they were fighting.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, we should think about policing as a response to our resistance to other oppressive forms. And not even, I think it's good that we talk about them deriving from slave patrols. It's like, we needed slave patrols because people first were free. Right. That's where the story starts, with freedom, not just with slavery, but with freedom. And then there was enslavement, and then there was resistance, and then there was policing. Because if people just voluntarily got on board, literally got on board, took a little cruise, came over, did a little stops, did some selfies, we wouldn't need police, right? But we need these systems of incarceration, arrest. We needed chains, right? All those tools had to be imagined and had to be created in order to stop people from being free. And what I think is exciting about abolition is that it's a fight to return to that freedom, right? Like, that's what we're trying to do. Yeah. We're trying to abolish police, the prison industrial complex, and all of these other systems that cause harm, so we can actually move closer to freedom. That's why that part is the pursuit of freedom in the title.
Yeah. Well, and I think that what distinguishes this book for me, and one of the things I love is that you really do, you acknowledge those whose ideas influence your development, right? But I think what distinguishes is that because you paint a landscape everywhere you go, you can actually see very clearly how now looks like then, right? Because you're doing this kind of deep observation of all the environments. So it's not just like it is a beautiful political analysis, but it's not just analysis. It actually gives you a window into all of the places you've seen, and you can see the structural relationship, between the 19th century and the 21st century.
Thank you.
And I think that's part of what it means to invite people to become, right? Because it's an invitation for people to observe differently. It's also just, I love how you talk about becoming I think the first time you really become a writer is when you're in ROTC, right?
Yes.
Which I think is really great, because, the reality is that we sort of those of us who get access to these institutions that are part of the reproduction of social class, reproduction of inequality, right? We have this complicated political relationship to the institutions, and yet we still try to figure out ways to become, if we believe in something like freedom, right? And it's always vexed, it's always complicated, right? But can you talk a little bit about that, like becoming because that's how you get into the stories at first, right?
Yes, of course. So I think what I try to do is be in conversation with people who are curious, right? Who feel some sort of way about police abolition or critiques of the military because they have people in their family who are cops, or they are veterans, and they're just like, oh, you just, hate people who serve this country, or you don't care about Black communities. And it's like, well, no, there are lots of people who have been politicized or have come to abolitionist politics who've been in a lot of the spaces that we're now critiquing, right? It's because of our relationship and our proximity to lots of these spaces. And what I've noticed is that when people, the phrase right now is like directly impacted. And it's interesting because the people who are directly impacted or at least I feel like they're a lot of times they're being used to push a particular agenda, right? That's like often wedded to some of the, like, sadly, like the things that we're trying to dismantle, right? So what I tried to show is like, yeah, I have this robust critique of militarism. And I was an ROTC kid. I was the ROTC kid. I was squadron commander. I was going to military camps. I was a pilot of an airplane. Like ROTC was my world. One of my closest instructors, I love that woman to this day. Like I love this woman. ROTC was a safe haven from a lot of the violence that was happening in the schools. And I believe that our instructors really, really, really cared about us, yes. Right? And so it's like, oh yeah, I can see how someone who's criticizing the military, it's just like, oh, like you just don't care about these people. It's like, oh no, I've like gone through this. I know this, right? I haven't been in a war, but I like, this culture was important to me. I understood what it represented. My grandfather was a veteran, my uncles were, I like, this was so much. I used to get in trouble for unfolding the flag that wrapped my grandfather's casket. My grandma was like, girl, leave that in the closet, right? So it's something it meant a lot. And then I started understanding like, oh, right. My family, so many of them went into the military because there was no other jobs in our community. Yeah. Right? It was what Reverend Barber calls a poverty draft. Yeah. Right. And I think that's true for lots and lots and lots of people. When I was in college, I worked at a call center, and I would have to interview people for their health insurance for USAA, which is like the largest supplier of like healthcare for the military. And I would see these kids, 19, 20 years old, overwhelmingly Latinx. I mean, their incomes fit $19,000, $20,000 a year, trying to support a family, trying to figure out if they're going to be able to be buried in America if they die. And so just so much exposure to that. It's like, yeah, we can hold both. We can understand that these institutions are unfortunately a lot of our people's way into stability, right? And then we can say, is that right? Is that enough? Should you have to sign up to die in order to get stable housing, healthcare, education, childcare, right? Is that actually fair? Is that fair? And one of the first times I heard that critique was right after I finished TFA. And someone told me, there are kids that go to TFA and there are kids that go to the military. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, that's very, 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 very true. There are kids who get gap years, who get $40,000 just to travel the world before they go to college because their family thinks it was good for them to have the exposure. Mm-hmm. There are other kids who go to jail. Right. And so I understand us wanting to protect these institutions that we have been conditioned to believe to be sacred and important. And I just hope that people, examine why do we have these institutions in the first place? Why are they the most well-resourced institutions in our schools, in our country? It's reflective. These budgets are all reflective. Why are RTC programs mostly at poor Black high schools throughout the country, right? It's like, that doesn't take away the love that I have for my ROTC instructor, but it does give me better terms to critique the institution itself. So that's why I hope people sort of see in the book. You know, I was in an organization called Youth Crime Watch of America to support relationships between law enforcement and kids in our neighborhoods, right? It's like, oh yeah, that's not good. Like that's really, really, really bad. Do I love the mentor who got me in that program? Absolutely. Do I think their program is bad? Absolutely. So that nuance is what I hope to share in the book.
You do share that. And I also love that you put in the detail of your mother being like not wanting you to go into the military, because, and you do this in many places, because I think it's also important to show that there is like an active political engagement around all these issues in our community, right? Like, so there's exploitation, there's deprivation, there's also a lot of thought, a lot of ways that people are trying to figure out how to make sense of things, and a lot of critique, right? Like there's yeah. And I think that's
to this point, please.
Yes, please.
The biggest pet peeve I have is when people tell me this isn't accessible to our communities. The abolition so it's not accessible to our communities. Who are you talking about? You're not talking about my community, right? And so my mom, can she define imperialism? No. Can she critique the military's imperialistic pursuits? Absolutely. Right? Yeah. It's like, I was just the other day, I was listening to Nas and Lauryn Hill, If I Rule the World, which is my jam.
Oh,
and, you know, and she sings the hook. And what does she say on the hook? If I rule the world, she would do what? You know, I free all my sons, right? She don't say all my nonviolent,
right?
Yes, send them to Africa, right? It's not I'll free all my nonviolent offenders. That's not what she say. That's not the song. That's not the verse, you know? It's like there's so many other ways that we talk about. I mean, there are people literally, I know people who have been sent to prison for murder, and I've watched their families literally say, free my son, XYZ, free my child, free my baby, free my homie, free my nigga. Like, I know all of that. And it's like, you don't think the people who I know who regularly call for the freedom of the people who are murderers who are in prison right now, who probably kill someone in retaliation or out of self-defense, you don't think they have an analysis that the whole system is wrong, and that the incarcerated institution that's holding their loved one is unjust, right? That the situation that that loved one was in the first place was unjust, but they don't understand abolition, but yet they're calling for freedom for murderers. So it makes me so frustrated. Like, how do we make this accessible? It's like, shouldn't we always just be in conversation with lots of different people?
Yeah.
What's this translation thing? So yes, I'm so happy you mentioned that. Now it just makes me so mad.
Yeah, well, it's inferior, and it's also, you like really beautifully talk about then what it means, right? So when we call 911 or we call the police, it is with that knowledge, right? This is about, that's also a consequence of a kind of captivity, right? Like, because what does one do? And you have this story that brought tears to my eyes about your babies being locked in the car, and and how to not, what do you do? Right.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. And I've gotten, let me say this, it's been less pushback recently, but I remember getting so much pushback from Black women about abolition, and not like people who I grew up with, but actually like a certain kind of nonprofit industrial complex, right? So, it's so sad that of all the racial gender groups, Black women, poor Black Latinas, they call the police the most to escape domestic violence situations. They call more than white women, right? And some people use that as proof that, look, if we remove the police, we're gonna leave all these Black and brown women you care about so vulnerable to violence. What are they gonna do? You don't care about them. And then when you look at the research and you see, well, here are the stated reasons why white women call 911 less. And the number one reason is resources. They have stronger financial and social resources to leave a situation. It gives them a little bit more agency, right? It helps them figure out, well, I don't have to be in this relationship because I'm not worried about healthcare or childcare.
Right.
or credits for, right? The level of mobility is completely different. And instead of investing in all of what would make, Black women, brown women, indigenous women, what would increase their agency or resources, you actually cheapen it and only invest in the police. Right? So you're actually doing a disservice. Policing is a cheap way out, right? So if you actually want to create measures that make people more safe, then we will invest in them. And the story about my kids, Juice and Garvey, in the car was so scary because there wasn't a locksmith in Southeast DC, right? The closest one was in Northwest, an hour away. And so, okay, do I break the window? Do I call 311? Nothing. Do I go flag down the fire department? Nothing. Then it's just like, okay, call 911. Please do not send police. There literally is a fire station at the end of my block. And the cops get there before the firefighters. And so it's just, how do you navigate this situation? I'm an abolitionist at this point, and it's just frustrating because I have to protect my babies. And and what ended up happening, the police couldn't even help.
Right. And I think this is really important too, because you bring the reader into the moment and you feel it. Well, I felt really profoundly, and also all of the moments, right? So like, it's not, you make the critique of like the distribution of resources and why this institute, but let's also look at the institution, right? In various ways. When people say like, well, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? Wait, okay, but then look at how police officers behave, how violent an institution it is, right? And so you like bring us through a different kind of analysis than folks usually give, because we like, people will say, kind of, everybody knows Black folks don't like cops, right? Right? But like, that's like a commonplace, but you give us the answer to why as part of the foundation of the analysis of why it's important to become abolitionist. And you correct the misperception of what the word means, right? It's, like, people think it just means nothing.
Yes.
And also people think it's not about, and you said about relation, like what kind of human relationships we're trying to create in a healthy, humane, just society would be different, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think the murderous question, the questions around sexual violence, those are the two big questions that I had. And the more I started to organize and do work around abolition and like in real life, when it transitioned from studying to, okay, I'm a lawyer now, I have to do abolition workshops with like community organizations that I work with. And they would ask, what about the murderers? They weren't asking from a place of antagonism, right? They were asking because they were vulnerable to all kinds of violence from their neighbors, their partners, their children, strangers, cops. And so what's been helpful is thinking, what does it mean to be a murderer actually? What are the kinds of murderers? Why do people kill people? Because if we get to those more nuanced questions, we can come up with better solutions and better answers, right? Mm-hmm. To figuring out how to actually prevent murder instead of having a well-funded, army of body searchers to go and retrieve it after someone dies. And so that's been really helpful for me to think through and to practice. How do we get to this specific harm? How do we reduce that harm? And if we get to the point where right now, I think we're like at 15,000 murders in the US a year. If we are implementing an abolitionist practice, we're defunding, dismantling police, and we're also, we're reducing the reasons why people call 911. We're eliminating the harm. We're combating homophobia and patriarchy and ableism. We're getting to that point. And we get those murders down to 2,000, 1,000. Well, maybe we can have better accountability, right? For the 1,000 people instead of for, yes. Right, because right now the police clearance rate for murder is like 40%, which means 60% of people who murder someone are not even arrested or charged. Right. And the 40% who are arrested or charged, that doesn't mean that they're all even convicted.
That's right.
And then you have people
or guilty, right? Yeah.
What'd you say?
Or guilty.
Well, even guilty, exactly. And then I know in St. Louis, I'm sure there's a widespread practice. If there's someone who fits a profile for killing someone, cops are so eager to pin other murders on that person to increase their clearance rate. So it's like, well, that's not just, that's not saving lives. How can we actually get to, 2,000, 1,000, and then for those 1,000 people, how can we better assess what happened? How can we have better accountability instead of just putting people in a cage? Like, that's not just.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask, because I could go on asking you questions forever. I want to ask because there's some really good questions in the Q&A. And this one, I think, is a really potent one, given what we were just talking about. Nell Pepper asks, can you provide guidance on reconciling prison abolition with the catharsis and relief that can come with high-profile guilty verdicts, Chauvin, R. Kelly, Weinstein, and the hope and expectation that those convicted will be punished?
Ooh, love this question. Very hard question. And because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to say it depends.
Okay.
Right. It depends. Right. And because catharsis is real. It's not, I think what's great about that question was actually very different than how I've been asked, is that it seems as if the person asking recognizes that it's not justice. Right. It's like, this is not justice. This is not a win. This is not going to help us towards liberation. And in fact, it could backfire, right? Because now you have an entire group of angry Black men around this conviction, and it can increase violence against women. And so we have to think large scale. Well, what does this conviction mean for this one person, for this community, for survivors, for all of them, right? And then what are the different ways it's going to impact, everyone relating to it? So I think that the person who asks the question realizes that it's not justice, it's guidance that I'm receiving. And I think that's guidance that's important to share. I think for police convictions, what could definitely bring a sense of relief, the nervousness that I have, and I'll recall this from Troy Davis and looking at Mumia's case, right? The two people who sort of on death row, is that whenever we use the terms of these oppressive systems as justice or relieving or right, there are other people who are also using those terms who are fighting against us, right? So there's an entire movement to free Mumia, to get him out of prison. He's like the longest serving prisoner on death row. Most famous political prisoner in the world, most famous prisoner in the world. There's an entire movement for Mumia's freedom, and that movement is in the name of justice. There's also an entire movement to keep Mumia on death row, right? There's a movement saying this is justice, that this person is on death row to die, right? And they're fighting to ensure that he's going to stay on death row. They're fighting against him receiving medication. They're fighting against him receiving COVID treatment, because they believe that's the cost of incarceration and death row when you've been convicted of what Mumia has been convicted. The same with Troy Davis, right? There was a movement to get him free in the name of justice. And on the other side, there was a movement to keep him on death row. Now, with the convictions, whatever the convictions, the sentences, whatever those are going to be for cops, that's going to be just the ceiling for them, but it's going to be the floor for us, because the people who are fighting to maintain those those illegitimate systems, they're going to employ the same language, and those institutions are just incapable of delivering justice. Mm-hmm. Peter Liang, when he was convicted, when he was arrested and charged, I was like, wow. I think this is chapter 3. I'm like, oh, wow, police are starting to get charged. This is so exciting. Like, this is justice. This is whatever. He gets convicted. He's found guilty. He gets 0 jail time. You look at the cop who killed Oscar Grant. He got like 2 years, maybe. You look at the cop who killed, you look at Jason Van Dyke, who killed Laquan McDonald. You look at all these cops who get convicted, who get sentenced. Right now, Derek Chauvin is trying to appeal his conviction. And so it's just like, well, I can understand the catharsis, because I think that's a part of our emotion. We've been conditioned around wins and losses, and this feels like a win, and when it feels good, like it feels so, so good. I think recognizing that it's not justice and that it could potentially backfire, like that's something that we should always keep in mind when these major moments happen.
Yeah, I hope it's not overstepping to say, I think in many ways you answer the question through the kinds of stories you tell in the book in an unfolding way, because what you what you show repeatedly is that the production, like these consequences, as rare as they are produced by constraint, right? Like, so someone like R. Kelly, right, is that becomes a remedy because we don't have a social order
Exactly.
that protects people against extremely wealthy, especially Black girls,
Exactly.
extremely wealthy people, right? So that if that last resort that doesn't work.
It's just the police. Yes, I love that point so much because in the wake of the Me Too movement, one thing I noticed that's happened is that a lot of the men who's lost their jobs have just been replaced by women, right? But one thing that hasn't shifted a lot is hierarchy. And where there's more hierarchy, there's more exploitation and more vulnerability.
Yes.
So it's like, well, we can't just get rid of like men, because women also uphold patriarchal culture, also commit sexual. Right. So it's just like, well, what fights, what can make people more safe? Like, well, if we had less hierarchy in these corporate spaces, not just more diverse ones, but if we started chipping away at the hierarchy, chipping away at who people like R. Kelly have access to because of age and status, maybe we can have a more just society. And that's what I mean by just relationships.
Mm-hmm. There's this other good question, which is about how much propaganda such as Law and Order and NCIS contribute to the American desire to cling to the police force.
Can someone free my mama from the chains of Law and Order? I pray for this all the time. She's like, no, I saw it on Law and Order. I'm like, mom, you can't do this. You just can't do this. And I'm saying this as someone, there's this show that I watched the other day called The Sinner. Uh-huh. And it's just the same storyline as like this one competent cop who like gets it right. And the whole force is just not, they're just like especially terrible. But he's just like, these people didn't murder people for no reason, and I'm gonna get to the bottom of it. And I'm like, man, I'm kind of rooting for this cop a little bit. Then you're like, oh, wait, no, this is problematic. Michelle Alexander, I think she was the first person who I read who wrote about propaganda. I don't know if she used the phrase propaganda, but she talked about how these shows, how this art, it gives legitimacy to policing. It shows you that, look, there are all these horrible people in the world who just want to steal your stuff, break into your homes, like hurt you, abandon you. And then when you start, diving into some of the statistics of who is actually vulnerable to harm, they never match the storylines, right? So most of the people who experience burglary and theft, their incomes are like under $7,500 a year, right? And there's no NCIS, whatever the acronym is. There's no episode about people breaking into each other's trailers.
Right.
No, right? It's like it's poor people, Black people trying to like get over on someone who has resources. Right. So yeah, they absolutely they do not help the cause at all. We should. I'm happy that Color Change goes out after some of these shows like Cops. It's just terrible. It's just terrible stuff. It just showcases and it's propaganda, but it's also very, very, very anti-poor and very, 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 very racist.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think sometimes the way that we consume media is actually like a sort of trauma response, right? That people go back into the thing that is so, destructive in daily life through media, right? And to try to break that, I think, is a complicated thing, but it's such an important point. The next question is a teacher who's asking about your plan potentially, or if you have interest in writing a young adult version of this book.
Oh, wow. I hope young adults can read this version, but yeah, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. I think that's a really good idea. I'm not sure if that's
kids.
What'd you say?
I mean, mate, you work with kids already too.
Yeah, yes. I mean, my oldest kid, he was very angry at me when he was reading over my shoulder when I was writing about maroons. And he was like, Mom, you know what little kids don't know what maroons are. This book isn't for us. And so I've already gotten my first piece of feedback of not making sure something's accessible. But I think a middle school version, I think, yeah, I would, yeah, I don't know if that's up to me. This is all very, very, very new to me, but I would be excited. I know that we have a education resource guide that is going to come out in the next couple of weeks, and then one for faith communities. And so I'll talk to my publisher and see what she thinks about adapting it for a younger audience.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's really beautifully written. It's a literary achievement, but I do think with guidance, middle school kids can access, like you'd have to do lesson plans, but yeah.
Yeah, I could do it. Yeah, I'll ask. Yeah.
It would be a good thing. Can I ask, I mean, we're almost coming to the end. What do you want the book to do in the world?
What I want the book to do?
Yeah.
So much. I want the book to be an entry point for lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds. And I think that one question I would often get is who do you see as your audience? Even my editor was like, who do you think your audience is? And I was like, I don't know, students, faith community, people who are skeptical about abolition, lawyers, like there's so much in the book for people who identify with so many different like backgrounds. And so I was just like, I'm just not sure. So the benefit of that is I hope that it's an entry point into more beautiful creative politics, you know, for lots of people, you know, who have examined politics or unexamined politics, or who are curious about what this movement means. I hope that it's that it offers a range of texts, like thinkers, organizations. I mean, every chapter is really filled with people who've pushed me to think more creatively and more beautifully about the world. And so there's just endless, I mean, there are organizers, there are activists, there are artists, there's so much stuff in the book that I hope that it piques people's curiosity to continue to figure out what their own political and intellectual journey is around these topics and much more. The book, I think, what I wanted to do, I hope that it encourages people to either join organizations, you know, or to support organizations that are trying to fight for a more free world, and to push back on the idea that abolition is solely about destruction. And we have every right to be solely about destruction, because, you know, you should destroy things that are violent and harmful to you, especially arbitrarily. But I hope that it shows that we're in a broader tradition of people who are fighting for freedom. Mm-hmm. What else I want? I wanted to make my kids proud, you know. I hope that's what I want the book to do. I really want them to look back and see that, you know, mom was on the right side of history. I wish, I don't know if this is self-important. I heard this really good quote today that says self-importance engraves its own headstone with no name. It was so beautiful, right? But I hope that, you know, 100 years from now, if we're still printing books in a way that's eco-friendly, I really hope that it's seen as an offering, like in this broader tradition of abolitionist struggle. So those are like some dreams, some hopes, some desires.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love this. You say this on page 194. For me, being an abolitionist is not a static position, but about learning, dreaming, practicing what we need until we get free. I'm always becoming. I mean, don't you feel it even when you hear it back and they're your words? But that, it's profound. Okay, we do have some other. I want to ask this question though, and this may, you know. So your mother gave you two professional options.
Yes.
And one, you know, lawyer, doctor, and you were on the path. Was she right?
Oh, was she right? Don't tell her I said this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think she was absolutely right. I think that there are incredible people who are fighting. Doctors are saving so many lives right now, you know, with their time, with their energy, with their advocacy. I think it's obvious. I have so much respect for great doctors, especially doctors with, you know, social justice analyses. I think for me, she called it. Yeah. She called it, like she got it.
It was so, like reading it and knowing, you know, because I think every profession, every kind of institution, there's always the capacity. I mean, there's always the worry, the threat that one just becomes a cog in the wheel and sustained, injustice. But there's some, right? There's some of these professions that have this insurgent possibility built in. And given like the way the voice that we hear of your mother through, like, it's like, oh yeah, okay, we can see the seeds are planted.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think she's right. That and the writing, I think too. Between her and my grandmother, I don't think I didn't have no hope. I was gonna write at some point.
You were destined to be a writer too. Yeah. Okay. Okay, this is not a question. Oh, this one I think is really, really important. How do you respond when people minimize police killing Black people by saying, well, Black people kill Black people? And they also say, thank you for your dedication.
This is my favorite question in the whole world. So much so that it's literally my next book. My next book is What About Black on Black Crime?
Oh, yes.
It's what I'm working on right now. It's what I'm working on right now. The reason, I can just give a little preview, it blew my mind when I learned that What About Black on Black Crime was originally a critique of police. It was, you all care about crime that happens in white communities. You go fight it. What about Black on Black? What about us? So it was a call for equitable policing that has now been inverted to be a critique against like people who are protesting police. And so I think that genealogy is so fascinating. It shows how much this history has been obscured, how much has been repressed, right? That now we're regurgitating these lines that we're actually trying to fight for better policing. So I think that's so important. So much. So community-based violence is a problem. It's absolutely a problem, right? It's similar to what I said about the cheap way out is investing in policing. So you can look at St. Louis, where I'm from. St. Louis has among the highest murder rates in the country. Its sibling cities are like Chicago, Newark, Detroit, DC. St. Louis is not, if it's not at the top, it's number 3, okay? St. Louis also has the highest per capita of police in the country, right? So we have the highest murder rates and the highest per capita, but the crime rate isn't dropping, right? The murder rate isn't dropping. Look at Chicago, right? Everyone says, oh, you want to abolish the police? Okay, go live in Chicago. Well, Chicago has a huge police force. Yeah. Look at the budget of the police in Chicago. Look at the killings in Chicago, right? So if more policing correlated with reducing Black on Black crime or Black on Black violence, then there would be no Black crime in Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, DC. So it's obviously an ineffective solution to trying to undermine community-based violence. And when you ask Black communities, what would make you more safe? What would make your neighborhood thrive? What would make sure that you and your families are on a path towards success? And it's, oh, we want our schools funded. But that's not what Chicago does. They cut libraries. Rahm Emanuel closed like 30 schools. You see Philly closing schools. You see St. Louis closing schools. You look at Newark, lose democratic control for Black communities. You see divestment. They know how to defund education. They know how to defund K-12, right? And so then it's like, oh, you want, no. So Black people, they ask for jobs. You're not going to summer program your way out of community-based violence. You need robust economic investment, right? We're watching a massive housing crisis. People are going to be so precarious. And the more precarity that we have in our communities, the more likely we're going to have violence, right? And so let's invest in what makes neighborhoods stable, and that will give us safety. But instead, politicians take the cheap way out and only invest in police. And it actually increases the amount of community-based violence in our neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And on that note,
sorry, I'm like out of breath.
No, that's perfect.
Yes,
everybody needs to get this incredible book, and then after they read it, they will be waiting hungrily for the next. And I just want to thank you personally. Before I'm going to take a few extra seconds, but before I met you 5 years ago, which feels like 10 years ago,
I can't believe it. Yeah.
I heard about you and about you. I know you have a wonderful disposition to understand that you don't like claim labels because there's always work to be done. But I heard about you as a freedom fighter, and I remember meeting you and saying right afterwards, she's the future. And so I am just immensely grateful for your work in helping illuminate things for me, for carrying the torch for us collectively, and for writing this incredible book.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I tell you all the time, you're my favorite writer. You make me cry involuntarily all the time. You have such
mutual now.
No, it's just, you just have such a commitment to the craft of writing and also conveying really important politics through stories and capturing. It's like, I didn't even know I was learning about race until I read this sentence, right? That's why I felt when I read The Bluest Eye. Like, I didn't, and so I get so much of that from your work. And thank you so much as being just a truth teller and a fighter for us all. I really, from the bottom of my heart, I mean that.
Thank you both so much for being here and giving this really, really amazing conversation. Derecka, please come back to Harvard Bookstore for that next book. That sounds amazing. I really want to read it, and I want to read this one too. And I'm so excited that we were able to host you. And I want to, what was that line you just said? We're not going to summer program our way out of like organized violence. I'm like, can we get that like on a slogan? Like, that's so good. Thank you both so much for being here. I appreciate both your time, Derecka, Imani. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at home who's tuning in tonight.
Thank you so much for coming on a Friday night. Thank you so much.
Again, thank you for supporting an independent bookstore and supporting our authors, publishers, as well as incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. Again, check out the link in the chat if you would like to purchase a copy of Becoming Abolitionists. You will not regret it. It's a fantastic book. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your night, everyone. Take care.